My hands are freezing while I'm filming this video. But I want to find a subject for painting. It looks like there's nothing, but in reality there is something. And today we're gonna paint this slightly frozen but beautiful green leaves during winter time. Line drawing is available for download, removing the excess amount of graphite. Now we can start mixing watercolors. Starting with lemon yellow, we see in this holly a lot of yellow greens. Adding ultramarine blue, more lemon yellow, more brighter, and a little touch of alizarin crimson. And as you can see, it immediately tones down the very bright green watercolor mix. For the second mix, I'm taking ultramarine blue, a little bit of lemon yellow, and adding perlin green for more darker, more saturated watercolor mix for those shadow areas, and little touch of alizarin crimson. Be very careful with alizarin crimson, it can instantly turn your green paint into brown. Testing on a piece of paper and adjusting watercolors, adding a little bit of more lemon yellow to make it more warmer green. We see this holly branches, it's a lot of yellowish green mix. This holly has reddish stem, so I'm adding alizarin crimson with a little touch of sap green. It gives more browner and reddish browner watercolor mix, which will be perfect for painting stems. And adding more alizarin crimson for some brighter areas at the very top of leaves. Separately adding perlin violet. For darker areas, adding alizarin crimson and perlin green. Maybe we will be needing that color. And now we can start painting. One leaf at a time, using round synthetic brush, starting with water layer. Remember to change your water after mixing watercolors. We need those very bright areas, shiny areas on those leaves quite white, so dark water will mess our light area. Taking first mix, which is lemon yellow, ultramarine blue, and little touch of alizarin crimson, and starting from the leaf area that is slightly darker, moving to the other side of the leaf, and leaving that light area that we see on the reference unpainted. And I'm leaving it much wider than it appears in the reference. It's better to have bigger amount of light rather than small and lose it during layering. With the round synthetic brush, I'm spreading watercolors towards the outer edges of this leaf and smoothing carefully. Everything is very light, very transparent. First layers are super light. We can always go darker. Moving to the next leaf, and the same technique, the same approach, very transparently, very lightly, leaving the lighter area much wider, constantly checking reference. I have reference opened right beside my tutorial. Always encourage you as well. I'm placing a reference in the video screen. That's for general information, but to see all details, all tonal values, open the reference right beside you and you will be able to follow along. With the finer tip brush, while the surface is still wet, I'm wiping out the middle vein, washing brush, cleaning in paper towel and wiping out the middle vein with the very tip of that brush. Moving on to the bigger leaf of this composition, applying watery layer to paper surface with round synthetic brush, just enough water to watercolors be moved. You can start with one half of the leaf, then continue to the other. I'm going for the whole leaf, but you can also pause the video and do one half and then the other half. Remember to leave light area and adding a little bit of darker to the area that we see in the reference is much darker, but still very transparently and very lightly. first layer is done for the leaves, very transparently, very lightly. Now let's paint stems. I have a reference in front of me and I can compare how this looks in real life. And that is so amazing when you have a subject in front of you, so you can really check the right color tones. With a finer tip brush, use the very tip of the brush, and it's important for this holly to have a very thin stem. It will look much better if the stem is much thinner even than the reference shows. It will look neater and more elegant. Painting with the very tip of the brush, darker side is on the right, and careful zoom in closer the reference and you will notice the structure of the stem. Even if you will have one darker line on the right and much lighter line on the left, it will look very good. This is a very thin, very small stem. It should stay the same in the painting. As I'm zooming in closer so you can see the structure that I'm painting, there is this darker little line before each section of dividing, where the leaves are divided to both sides. Take a look in reference, zoom in closer. You will notice that in that little reference that is in the video, it's not possible to see that, but you can definitely zoom in closer your reference and study carefully. This will make a very nice addition to your painting if you will have these little things painted. And the red line, the red stem, goes into the vein of the holly. Paint with the very tip of the brush. Careful observation is key element in realistic watercolor painting. Now surface is completely dry and I can start applying second layers to my leaves, starting with the same leaf that we started, and carefully with tiny brush strokes, studying the reference. Now adding another layer, still going very lightly, very transparently. When I add next layer, I also start from the shadow area, the darker area, and I go transparently. Key element is careful observation of your reference and small brush strokes of your finest brush. Here we have the size of this composition is almost the same as it is in real life, and it is quite small. To make all those details, I will not be adding all those little tiny veins that we see in the reference. This is quite big work, and almost it would be very hard for such a small dimension of the composition, and also the time frame is not allowing me to go into crazy detailing. I am showing you the approach, the way. This is just the beginning stages of realistic watercolor painting. You can definitely push yourself further and do more detailing. Little tiny brush strokes with transparent watercolor mixes from darker area towards the lightest parts. Gradually, brush strokes also make those transitions. When you are starting from darker, the brush is full of pigment, and then gradually towards the lighter part, and it gradually becomes lighter. And as you can see from my color palette, I'm taking a very small amount of watercolors to build the volume and realism of this leaf gradually, slowly. No rush, no saturated watercolor mixes, slowly building. And the main thing is to carefully look in the reference. Notice those changes, how dark areas go into halftones and halftones become lighter spots. And lightest parts are very shiny because the surface of the leaf is very shiny glance. Painting slowly, the approach is the same, technique is the same. Building another layer with the tiny brush strokes with the very tip of the brush. leaving little tiny gaps for the secondary veins. But this branch, this holly leaves can be painted also without veins. Just those transitions and contrast between lighter and darker part, and leaving that light shiny area super light. You can also paint without secondary leaves, leaving space only for the main middle vein. I will add some secondary veins, but not as many as it is visible in the reference. Carefully painting around the edge line, and the tip of the sleeve is going slightly away from us and is in the shadow. Taking a darker mix and carefully with the very tip of the brush, almost like a stippling method when you add little dots, little tiny dots to get darker area, very tiny brush strokes, because the area is so small, so narrow, and we want to make as those transitions as gradual as possible and moving forward slowly and gradually. No need to rush. If you feel the urge to rush, better pause, better take a break, go for a walk, paint other work, or do something completely different, then come back relaxed and work on the painting further, slowly and gradually. Also, the upper part of the leaf is a little bit darker than the rest of the sleeve's body. Careful, study the reference. Zoom in that one leaf, particular leaf that you are working right now, and take a closer look at those tonal values, transitions, shiny area. What do you see? Do you see those things that I'm painting right now? Where's the darker? Where's the lighter? Slowly moving forward with the same watercolor mixes that we have from the beginning, and carefully with the outer edge. We want to have those spikes very sharp and visible, even if the leaf is so small and tiny. And gradually the sleeve starts to become more realistic, more gradual transitions, and those light areas are still light. I'm not painting in the lightest parts, just working with the shadow and halftones. And leaving the middle vein as thin as possible. This is a crucial with painting leaves, to have those veins super thin. In the reference it is even thinner, but with each new brush stroke from the shadow area, from the darker area, I'm making that vein even thinner and thinner. It should look like a hair, super thin. With the thick looking veins, leaves don't look realistic. And the outer edge, the very tip of this leaf, is much darker, It turns away, it curls away from us, from the viewer and from the light source, and goes into the darker areas, shadow area. Also, the upper part is slightly darker and leaving those little gaps for the secondary veins. But again, as I told you, you can paint this leaf without those secondary veins. Just work on your gradual transition and slow painting of and building this volume. Adding a little bit more darkness, gradually the sleeves becomes even more vivid, more darker. Now it really stands out from the rest of the composition, but we are just working on this one particular leaf and slowly building it, slowly making it more realistic, more three-dimensional. Working with the very tip of the brush, and I'm still looking at reference My eyes are constantly moving from the reference photo to the painting, constantly checking for new things, and the more I look, the more I observe it, the more I start to notice some tonal changes, how that shiny area is. In the shiny area, I will add much later little tiny brush strokes because there are little tiny things visible. Now I'm adding a very light amount of ultramarine blue to my color palette, and will add a very light layer, light water layer to the shiny area. Shiny area has a little bit of blue color in it. And why? Because the shiniest part, the lightest parts are reflecting skies, and skies are blue. That's why the shiny area has a little bit of blue notion on that. It is a reflection of the sky. Maybe you don't see in a video, but that little blue touch gives a very nice finishing touch to the lightest parts. Let's move to the second leaf. I'm not completely finishing the first one because I want to leave a little bit room for the improvement after all of the rest of the leaves will be done. We don't want to overdo one area when we have more than one subject in one composition. We need to really think further. Don't overpaint. Don't make it too dark because then you will need to make everything super dark and intense. Better to leave it a little bit lighter, and when you will have all areas finished, you can adjust, maybe make a little bit darker, or it will be completely good as it is. At the very end, we will look at the overall look of this branch. The second leaf that I'm painting right now is slightly darker. There are no so vivid shiny areas because it's slightly turned away from the light source. Also leaving little gaps for the secondary veins and the middle main vein. Technique and approach is the same, with the very tip of the brush making tiny brush strokes, moving forward and painting to build more layers, more realistic look. Constantly checking reference, looking there, studying that leaf. Notice those tonal changes, little details. Everything that I can get the information from the reference, I apply to my painting. Carefully painting further, and as you can see, I left little gaps for the secondary veins. They are more visible, but I still need to make them thinner. They look quite thick at this moment. There's also room for improvement. And the upper part of the leaf, those veins should be slightly darker. I will apply a very transparent layer a little bit later, because that half, the upper half, is a little bit darker than the lower part. Applying another layer of watercolors, more darkness, more contrast to the upper part of this leaf. It is darker. It is one of the darkest leaves in this composition. More layers, more watercolors. Careful with the outer edge, working with the very tip of the brush. We want those edges to be nice, neat, and sharp. Now a closer look with the very tip of the brush, with very super light transparent amount of watercolors. I'm making a very fine line, 0.5 millimeter off the outer edge. We have that little edge which looks yellow in the reference. You really zoom in closer. In the reference, that line is much thinner that I'm painting, but I'm trying my best to make it super thin, super narrow. And as you can see, slowly each curve with the very tip of the brush, painting that very fine line. After that, I will fill that little gap with lemon yellow. Very fine and super transparent, as you can see. Slowly painting with the very tip of the brush. Take as finest brush you have with the smallest, more finest tip, and do that very slowly, very accurately. Don't use too saturated watercolor mixes right now. Better to have that line lighter rather than darker. And now filling that gap with lemon yellow, very light amount of lemon yellow. You can use your yellow that you have in your watercolor box, but be sure that it is yellow and light. Moving slowly and lightly, I'm constantly checking reference if everything is as I paint. And now loading my brush with alizarin crimson, and there are those little spikes at the very edges of those corners, and just with a little brush stroke, tick, 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 add that little spike. There's like little needles. They're quite sharp in real life. Now loading my brush again with a very light amount of watercolor mix and doing the same line for the first sleeve. Very accurately, very slowly, and my watercolor amount is super light. Now back to painting second leaf, adding a little bit more layer to get more contrast, more darkness, and as I apply another layer of watercolors, I'm making those veins slightly thinner. Moving forward slowly and accurately. adding more darkness right on the upper edge, just under that little yellow gap. I'm more building their darkness. I noticed that in my reference that edge, the upper edge, is slightly darker. Right down that little yellow gap, I see this area is slightly darker. Here is a close-up of that area that I'm painting slightly darker, the upper part of the sleeve, carefully with the very tip of the brush, just under that yellow line, yellow gap, yellow little edge, making that area a little bit more intense, a little bit darker. Painting lemon yellow over veins, main veins and secondary veins. Those veins are not white, they are more yellowish, and lemon yellow will do perfectly. The amount is very light, very transparent, and I'm going over the veins. Now taking alizarin crimson and sap green mix and adding that red watercolor mix inside on the upper part of the main vein. We see in the reference that the vein on the upper part is reddish, and then it gradually becomes more yellowish and finish yellow. It's not red all the way, just the upper part. And adding the same watercolor mix, making more saturated on the stem, painting the right side of the stem with the very tip of the brush darker, more intense. And I'm leaving a little gap in the middle of the stem where the light is hitting the surface, so that my stem looks realistic and three-dimensional. We need to have, even in that tiny area, darkness and light area. Now let's have a little break from painting greens and we can paint ribbon. That beautiful red bow that we have in the reference. I'm taking Sennelier red, a little bit more of Sennelier red. It can be cadmium red, Windsor red, even alizarin crimson. And to this red mix, Sennelier red mix, I'm adding Perlin maroon to get it more darker for the shadow areas. In the reference there's also seams in the lightest parts pink color. For that I will be using permanent rose. And as you can see, I added Perlin maroon and it instantly looks more saturated, more richer red color. Also be sure that your water is clean now when you are painting red area. With the round synthetic brush, applying water to the right side of this bow and taking a little amount of Sennelier red watercolors and applying, starting from the shadow area, leaving the lightest parts, the shiny parts, unpainted. Zoom in closer your reference, notice those tonal values, how they change, how they look. Washing my brush, cleaning in paper towel and spreading watercolor, smoothing the applied layer. Slowly and accurately, no rush here, better to go lighter than darker. Taking finer tip brush and painting the lower part that is visible in the reference, that is darker and very narrow area, very close to the first leaf that we painted. And be careful when you are painting around the green leaf. We don't want any red going into the green area. Do it patiently, accurately with the very tip of the brush. And look carefully, the lower part is in some area darker, then it becomes gradually lighter, and then the upper part of the bow is slightly darker. Take into consideration those tonal changes. That's what builds the flat looking subject realistic, not some kind of technique, not some kind of approach, but careful study of the reference. Adding darkness at the very base where they interact with each other, creating cast shadow area, but building that gradually. I'm not going straight with super dark. Everything is done carefully, accurately, slowly, transparently. Better to layer another layer rather than go straight super dark and then don't know what to do with the flat looking painting. Adding water with the finer tip brush to the upper part. Taking watercolors, and that area is in the shadow. Be careful to make it super thin. It is twisted. Be careful with the edge lines. Carefully, slowly and accurately painting the ribbon part. Adding darker watercolor mixes to make it more darker. It is twisted and turned away from the light source. Adding a very small amount of permanent rose to my color palette and then my brush, and adding that permanent rose to the lightest parts. They are in the reference quite saturated, and I see that there's a lot of pink. Pink is much cooler compared to Sennelier red, and the lightest parts are cool areas, and that's why they appear pink. We know from our mind that the ribbon is red, but how light is interacting with the surface, it changes. Does the color look warmer, more richer red, or does the color in the light area looks cooler? That means it goes towards the pink. With the finest brush, adding cast shadow area, checking the reference, noticing how I can separate these two ribbon parts. One is going up and casting shadow on the bow part, which is curved, and also separating the bow part, the upper part and lower part, the inner part. And that is achieved by careful observation of the reference. I'm constantly checking, and what I notice there, I apply to my painting with the very tip of the brush, careful applying little brush strokes to create more gradual transitions. And it slowly starts to appear more realistic, more three-dimensional. Careful observations and transparent layers. Light area is still light. And if my brush is pausing, maybe you think that I'm thinking, no, that moment I'm carefully observing reference. It doesn't matter how long I paint one subject or a composition or painting in general, my reference is my guide, my helper. All the information that I need is there. That is also the importance of the reference. It should be in good quality. you need to see all details, all tonal values. Sometimes we see some other reference, maybe from an advertisement or some other people took a reference, and at first glance you notice, oh, it's so beautiful, I want to paint it. But you really need to think a little bit, few steps ahead. Do you really see all the details? Will you manage all the steps that you need to achieve a realistic painting? Sometimes from the first glance it looks amazing, beautiful, even so tempting to paint. But when you start to ask many questions about the reference, about the path that you will be doing together while painting, and then you start to notice, or maybe that's not doable, or maybe those tonal values are not quite seen, or those details are blurred and I can't really get them. Really think few steps ahead of you when you take new reference and you didn't took it yourself, or even when you are taking a reference. Really take from different angles. When you will be at home or starting to paint, then you will have several references from which you can choose from. I always take a lot of references when I think of my painting or composition. My phone is full of photos, more different type of flowers, leaves, and many nature treasures rather than my family photos. But when I found something interesting, I really dig deep into it, take photos from different angles and different lights during daytime or morning or daytime or evening. The importance of reference is very crucial because you will be spending time taking all the information you need from the reference that you have. Continuing to paint slowly, adding more layers, and as you can see, that right half of the bow is beginning to look more and more realistic. Volume starts to appear. Still doing with tiny brush strokes. More layers, more layers. Finishing with the right side of this red bow, and we can get back to the green part. Now we'll continue to work with the third leaf, still painting with the finest brush, with the very tip of the brush. Approach is the same as the first two, carefully observing reference and with tiny brush strokes adding layers, starting from the shadow area, leaving little gaps for the main vein and secondary veins. Watercolor mixes are the same as we pre-mixed in the beginning. First one is lemon yellow, ultramarine blue, and a little touch of alizarin crimson. And second, which is much darker, more saturated, is lemon yellow, ultramarine blue, perlin green, and a little touch of alizarin crimson. Leaving lightest areas much wider than they appear in the reference, because then after many layers we can still have light area. If we will leave it as it is from the very beginning, as it looks in the reference, we will end up with no light at all. Tiny brush strokes moving forward, constantly checking reference all the time. It is all about careful observation of the reference. It is so important to have a good reference, to notice all tonal changes, to notice all the details. That is your guide. Adding darkness to the upper part of the leaf, it's much darker than the lower part. Painting with little tiny brush strokes, slowly and accurately, no need to rush. Really take your time. Work with the very tip of the brush carefully and accurately and transparently. The more layers will come, the more richer it will look. Really enjoy this moment into painting tiny, building from nothing at all on your paper till it starts to appear live and realistic and three-dimensional. It's magical. We can make the flat looking surface with the volume and three-dimensional painting. That is the trick of tonal values, careful observations of the reference, and slowly, accurately move your brush. Everything is doable with the tip of the brush, even those little secondary veins, and leave them as thin as possible. Leaves should have a very thin looking veins. Of course, if it's not like in real life, there are some veins with a super thick, there are some leaves with super thick veins. That is the other story. But most of the leaves have very fine veins. Now as I have more leaves ready, I can start to compare them, not just think of one leaf individually. Now I start to look at them as one whole painting, and I can compare. Maybe I need more darkness, maybe I need to build more contrast in some area. And as I apply a little bit more darkness to the second leaf, I also make those veins even more thinner. With each new layer, make those veins thinner. Now I will make those upper part veins look a little bit darker. I will not lose them. Even when I will paint over them with the transparent amount of watercolors, I will not lose those veins. They are calming down, toning down, but they are still visible because we have tonal values in places. Those leaves are super light, and when we go over with the light layer, they are still visible. The upper part veins are a little bit darker because they are in the shadow, and the lower part are lighter. Taking a very transparent amount of light blue and adding that very, very transparent amount to the lightest parts, to the shiny areas of the leaf. Again with the finer tip brush with super transparent amount of watercolors, adding that little line, leaving little gap for lemon yellow, for yellow pigment. That line should be very thin, very light, and now painting that little gap, 0.5 millimeter with lemon yellow. And that little detail gives a big difference. All those little tiny details create more and more natural and realistic looking painting. Building more layers, adding more darkness to the upper part of the sleeve. I still use the same amount of watercolors that we pre-mixed in the beginning. I did quite a small amount of watercolors, and as you can see, I still have it and we still are painting. No need to create big amount of watercolor mixes. With the professional watercolors, we can paint with small amount, quite a lot of space being painted with watercolor mixes. Adding more watercolors to the first leaf. As I start to look more and more on all of them, I notice what I need to add. I added lemon yellow to my watercolor mix because I noticed that I need more yellowish tone to my first leaf and also to others. And as you can see, the light area starts to narrow down. That's the importance to leave it bigger. We can always make something darker. The tricky is to make something lighter. Adding little tiny brush strokes into the lightest part of the first leaf. Making middle vein slightly thinner. covering lighter parts with the light amount of green mix, because if I compare this leaf to the first one, I will notice that the lightest parts, the shiny area on the first leaf, are super light and shiny, but this leaf doesn't have the same because it is slightly turned away from light source, and that shiny areas are not so vivid as the leaf, the very first leaf. And now those little ticks, little touches of the very tip of the brush with the alizarin crimson mix and sap green, adding those little spikes, those little needles on the very edges of the leaf. Painting into the leaf, we have a beginning part of the main vein, reddish. Really zoom in closer your reference. Notice these details, these changes in color tones. Painting stem a little bit darker on the right side. And separating, notice that little separation line in between sections of the leaves. Now let's start to paint the biggest leaf of this composition. And again, starting from the shadow area, I feel more safer when I start to paint from the darker area. I always start from the shadow area. And building towards the lighter part. Approach is the same as with the first leaves, leaving little gaps for the veins, and with tiny brush strokes building tonal values, building layers, contrast. Careful with outer edges, we want them neat and sharp and crisp. We need to get main characteristics of the subject, and this subject, this holly, has a very neat and crisp edges. Also, those spikes are super sharp. We need to take that into consideration. And also that the surface is super shiny. That's what makes those shiny areas super light. That is also that we need to show in our painting. We can skip some details. For example, those super tiny veins, we can skip that area. But main features we need to show. Each subject has something of its own, and we need to get that characteristics and show the main things in our paintings. In this case, those are super crisp edges, shiny surface, tiny spikes, tiny needles on the edges, and also super thin stem. Carefully applying watercolors, still the same watercolor mixes that we had from the beginning. Careful observation of the reference. applying watercolors and leaving little round spot that we see in the reference. There's little hole, which is also the edge of that little round hole is red. I will apply that later, but I'm leaving little round gap unpainted for the hole. Everything is done with the brush. We don't need to use masking fluid or white pigment. Everything can be painted with the very tip of the brush. And patience. That's the important part. No need to rush further, no need to make things faster. If you feel that urge, take a break, come back, relaxed, calm, and ready to move forward slowly, gradually. Loading my brush with alizarin crimson and sap green mix and painting a little tiny edge around that hole, and it gives a super nice touch to the sleeve. Also painting little edge line. I noticed in reference that it looks a bit red, but do it very, very thin. Another dot, some little spots. This sleeve has some little spots in red color. And moving forward with the green, building more. We need more contrast, more darkness.
Thank you.
A little bit more darker. That part of the leaf is much darker than I have right now, so I need only to paint further, more layers, and as I go I'm making those veins even thinner. With each new layer, veins are becoming thinner. Now I'm taking my round synthetic brush and a little bit of water and lemon yellow, quite transparent amount of watercolors, cleaning in paper towel the excess amount of watercolors and carefully going over the painted areas. I'm slightly smoothing the applied layer, giving more yellowish color to the shadow area, making also veins a little bit darker in the shadow area, and smoothing all those transitions even more. Don't overwork here. When you are going with the synthetic brush over some areas with the transparent amount of watercolors, be sure that you do with a few brush strokes. Don't overwork one area. You will start to lift out watercolors from that area. Just slightly, like a touch of butterfly wings, carefully and very slowly and accurately go over the areas. Also making veins thinner and smoothing all the areas. This leaf starts to look more realistic. I'm painting it for some time and only now it starts to look more and more with volume and three-dimensional, leaving light areas light, more gradual transitions from halftones to the shiny area. Another red spot. Washing my brush, loading with transparent amount of watercolors, and painting that again, very thin edge. Be sure that that line is super thin and super light. Leaving little tiny gap for lemon yellow to be painted there. Building more contrast, more darkness in the shadow areas. We can see closer to the middle vein, the area is much darker, more saturated. Painting very fine lines in the shiny area. I see in the reference that there are some parts even in the shiny area visible, so with the very tip of the brush, that's what I'm applying right now. Little tiny lines crossing each other, trying to replicate what I see in the reference into my painting. And it is all about careful observation. The more I look into the reference, the more I start to notice, the more I start to see. Constantly checking reference. My eyes are running from the reference to my painting. Getting more information. What can I add to my painting? How can I make it better? How can I make it more natural, more realistic? All the information is there. Now moving to the last leaf that we have, again starting from the shadow area. The outer tip of this leaf is very dark. It's curving away from us, away from the light source, and it goes into the shadow, and that's why it is much darker than the rest of the leaf. I'm still painting with the same amount of watercolors that we pre-mixed in the beginning. As you can see, I'm picking up watercolors from the edges of my color palette and still have watercolors. I almost finished all leaves with that amount of watercolor mixes that we pre-mixed in the very beginning. With the tiny brush strokes painting this leaf, careful observation and gradual transitions, transparent layers, making middle vein much thinner. Only now I'm adding a little bit more watercolors, perlin green with a little touch of lemon yellow. To paint a little bit darker areas. It's always okay to mix another amount of watercolors. Don't be afraid to run out of watercolor mixes. The more you mix, the more you will get to know watercolor mixes, the more you will practice, and also if the color tone will slightly be different than from the first one, your painting will only benefit from it. The more color tones of the same pigments you will have in your painting, the more beautiful it will look. Adding lemon yellow and a little touch of ultramarine blue, and painting further with tiny brush strokes, careful observation. Compare each section of leaf, compare upper part and lower part. Adding here also those tiny lines in the shiny area. Now is almost finished with painting leaves. I now look at the whole branch of this holly and add more layers where I notice that I need more contrast compared to other leaves. Now we are comparing each leaf with one another, each section. We're not thinking of each leaf as individual subject, but now we think of them as one whole, and we need to notice and have the darkness of one leaf in the same tonal value as darkness the other leaf. We can't have one leaf much darker, the other one much lighter. We need to be consistent in tonal values all across these leaves. That's why it's important not to finish completely. Leave a little gap where you can add more layers. Painting those little tips, little sharp needles, they are quite sharp. I'm adding a little bit of this red mix, which is alizarin crimson and sap green, to the darkest parts for this bigger leaf. I just noticed that it almost looks like there is red color, but I see in my painting that it really benefits with the little touch of reddiness in the shadow parts. Gives more contrast, more sharpness. Adding last brush strokes to the leaves, final touches, and we can move to the rest of the bough. Be sure that your water is clean, and with a round synthetic brush applying water to the left part of this ribbon of the bough, and starting to paint the same way as we did the first one, applying watercolor mixes to the darker parts, leaving lighter parts light as is paper. Watercolors are the same as we did with the first half of the bow, Sennelier red with perlin maroon, and for the lighter part, permanent rose. Slowly and carefully adding watercolors for more smoother and gradual transitions, adding a little bit darkness on the lower part, inner part of this bow, taking all those color transitions into consideration, where is darker, where is lighter. That way we can build volume for this bow and realistic look. All details are in the reference. Zoom in, careful observation, and apply everything to your painting. With a finer tip brush, while the surface is still a little bit moist, adding a little darker line for the fold and painting inner part on the lower part of this bow also darker. Smoothing with the round synthetic brush the applied more finer brush strokes for gradual transitions from the half-tones darker area towards the lighter parts. Painting further with the very tip of the brush. The surface now is dry as I apply next layers for more precision, and the paper needs time to rest, to dry, to receive another layer of watercolors. And as I go further, I also noticed to add some darkness, more contrast to the first part of the bow, to the right side, with tiny brush strokes. The area is quite small for painting. That's why my brush strokes are super small for greater precision. If I will paint small area with big brush strokes, I will lose the very small details, the transitions, the light area. That's why it's important to move slowly, gradually with tiny brush strokes to add more details, more realistic look. Noticing how that lower part of this bow, in some areas it is darker, then it becomes lighter. The same on the other side. And we are painting darker edge lines only there where it is visible in the reference. We're not just separating things with dark outline, with dark edge line. Be careful where you add it. If it is visible in the reference, then we paint it. Making this curve darker. Also, don't outline the edge of this curve dark. We need to have a very soft edge for this part because it is round. It goes away from us. So no crisp edge where the subject is round. Adding more darkness to the darker area and with tiny brush strokes moving towards the lightest part. Now I'm adding with my finer tip brush watery layer, but as you can see, I didn't change my water after painting red bow, but as I painted red, I'm not so afraid of applying that reddish water. But if that would be a green water, then it wouldn't be nice to have a green base for the red bow. Careful with outer edges. With the round synthetic brush, smoothing the applied layer and adding now with the finer tip brush darkness. In this section of bow, the reference is quite tricky and we quite see a lot of tonal transitions. Wiping out some area where I think the light can be hitting the surface. I don't quite see it. Very vague, very small light area is visible there. But I'm adding their light area. I'm assuming that there should be light, but the reference is not quite showing that. But I want to make this part of the ribbon more interesting, more vivid, and I need their light. Light areas are playing quite big role in realistic painting. If we will not have light, we will not be able to get a realistic and three-dimensional subject on the flat surface. Careful with finer brush strokes, adding another layer of watercolors of Sennelier Red and Perlin Maroon. Adding a very fine darker edge line on the upper part of this bow because I see that in the reference. Also, the lower part has a slightly darker line, but that line should be super thin. On the other side, I also notice a very fine darker line, edge line. And on the lower part of this bow. Adding a very small amount of permanent rose and watery wash over light areas with the pink pigment gives a cooler layer to the lightest parts. More contrast to the shadow parts, half tones, accurately with the edge lines. Comparing both sides of the ribbons so they are quite consistent in tonal values. Adding another layer, slightly darker. And I like that I have there also light areas, even that they are not visible in the reference. With watercolors, it's better to have more light. And greater contrast really pumps that light area even more. With round synthetic brush going over the light area with permanent rose, a very small amount of permanent rose, and loading round synthetic brush with Sennelier red and Perlin maroon, and smoothing the applied finer brush strokes. Making more gradual, more smoother look. Those light areas are very gentle, but they look very elegant and gives a very nice touch. Everything starts to look more and more vivid, more and more realistic. We are painting for quite some time. This is very small work with tiny brush strokes, tiny steps. I took quite a lot of breaks to finish this holly branch, but I really like the result. Adding final brush strokes to this holly. I really learned a lot during this painting process, and I really enjoyed this painting. Hope you also learned something new and found this painting beautiful and enjoyable and also doable. You can paint another 20 to 30 minutes, push yourself a little bit further. There is always room for improvement in realistic watercolor painting. Unless you're painting transparently, you can always add something new, some details, some layer, more contrast. Push yourself a little bit further with each new tutorial, with each new painting. Thank you for watching, thank you for being here, and see you in my next tutorial. Bye bye!